Imagine standing at the crossroads of three continents in the year 1099. To your west, the blue shimmer of the Mediterranean stretches toward a distant Europe you may never see again. Behind you, the desert fades into the flat, sun-bleached plains of the Euphrates. All around you the air smells of dust, blood, and possibility. You are a Frank, a Western warrior who has walked, ridden, and crawled thousands of miles to reach this place. And you have just conquered Jerusalem. What happens next is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of warfare. The Crusader States, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli were not simply colonies planted in hostile soil. They were living, breathing military organisms, perpetually adapting to an environment that would have crushed less resilient societies. For nearly a century, from 1099 to 1187, they held their ground against an array of opponents that included two of the most powerful empires of the medieval world, dozens of Turkish warlords, nomadic steppe cavalry, Arab dynasties, Armenian lords, Nizari assassins, Kurdish warriors, and Bedouin raiders. The story of how they did so, and ultimately why they failed, is one of the most gripping military dramas in human history. Before the Franks arrived, the Near East was already a cauldron of competing powers. To understand what the Crusaders were walking into, you must abandon any simple notion of Christian versus Muslim. The reality was vastly more complex. The Fatimid Caliphate, based in Cairo, controlled Egypt and had recently seized Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks, just weeks before the First Crusade arrived. The Fatimids were Shia Muslims, and their theological rivalry with the Sunni Seljuks was every bit as bitter as any religious conflict the Crusaders could bring from Europe. North of Jerusalem, the great cities of Aleppo and Damascus were ruled by Turkish warlords, whose loyalties shifted with the political winds. Further north, the Principality of Antioch was hemmed in by the Danish-mended Turks of Anatolia and the Armenians of Cilicia, Christian peoples who sometimes allied with the Franks and sometimes fought them. In the deserts, Bedouin tribes sold their loyalty to whoever paid best or threatened most convincingly. Across the region, Nizari communities, known in the West as assassins, operated their own shadow politics, eliminating inconvenient rulers for hire. This was not a two-sided war. This was a multi-dimensional chess match played simultaneously on a dozen boards, with the pieces frequently changing allegiance. The traditional image of crusading as a straightforward clash between Christianity and Islam is wildly too simplistic. Religious ideology was real and powerful. Jihad propaganda would eventually prove enormously effective in unifying Muslim opposition. But for most of the 12th century, the daily business of war was governed by pragmatism, opportunism, and the cold arithmetic of survival. Frankish lords and Muslim rulers made treaties, divided agricultural revenues, formed military alliances, and sometimes fought alongside each other against common enemies. When Godfrey of Bouillon entered Jerusalem in July 1099, no one could have imagined that this moment would give birth to states that would survive for nearly a century. The Crusaders had arrived with no clear plan for governance, limited manpower, and virtually no knowledge of the terrain. By any rational assessment, they should have been swept back into the sea within a decade. They were not. The first king of Jerusalem, Baldwin I, proved to be one of the most capable military administrators of his age. His priorities were clear. The coastal cities had to fall. For a state dependent on reinforcements and supplies from Western Europe, the ports were not luxuries. They were lifelines. Without Acre, without Beirut, without Sidon, Jerusalem was an inland island that could be strangled at leisure by its neighbors. The conquest of these cities was grinding, unglamorous work. Baldwin laid siege to Haifa in 1100, Arsuf and Caesarea in 1101, Acre in 1104, Most attempts failed on the first try. Asuf required 4 attempts before it fell. Sidon required 3. The statistics are telling. Of 23 recorded Frankish attempts to besiege fortified settlements between 1099 and 1118, only 8 succeeded, a success rate of just 35%. Slowly, city by city, the coastline was being secured. To the south, the Fatimids of Egypt remained a constant threat, launching repeated invasions across the Sinai. Baldwin defeated them at Ramla in 1101, again in 1102, though barely, and at Jaffa in 1103. Each victory was costly, each defeat was survivable. Slowly, the Fatimids began to learn that Jerusalem would not fall to the kind of set-piece warfare they preferred. Their armies were large, well-equipped, and often numerically superior, and they still kept losing. The reasons are fascinating. Frankish heavy cavalry, armored knights on war horses trained from childhood to charge in disciplined formation, represented a tactical package that Muslim armies of this period had not yet developed effective countermeasures against. The shock of a massed cavalry charge executed at the right moment against an unprepared formation could dissolve an army in minutes. Over 2 decades of conflict between Jerusalem and Egypt, the Franks achieved a remarkable near consistency of victory in pitched battle that contemporaries noticed and struggled to explain. Meanwhile, to the east, Baldwin was engaged in a slower, more patient struggle with Damascus over the agricultural region of the Hauran and the strategically vital Transjordan. The relationship between Jerusalem and Damascus was paradoxical. The two powers were almost permanently at low-level war, while simultaneously finding it in their mutual interest to avoid total confrontation. Treaties were made and broken with bewildering frequency, yet even as they raided each other's farms and seized livestock, neither side attempted the kind of existential assault that might have ended the conflict decisively. To understand the Crusader States militarily, you have to begin by appreciating that warfare here was not primarily a matter of great battles. Most of what passed for military activity was small-scale, relentless, and exhausting. Raids on crops and livestock, ambushes on roads, skirmishes at river crossings, the burning of villages, and the seizure of people who would be ransomed or enslaved. The Franks became expert practitioners of this kind of war. Raiding degraded the enemy's agricultural base, brought in plunder and ransoms, and kept frontier populations in a state of insecurity that made them more likely to seek accommodation with Frankish power. The Turks were, if anything, even better at raiding. Turkish cavalry, fast, lightly armored, capable of covering enormous distances, could penetrate deep into Frankish territory, devastate an agricultural region, and disappear before any response could be mounted. The Kingdom of Jerusalem's farmers lived in permanent awareness that their crops might be burned by autumn. This asymmetry created a strategic equilibrium that proved remarkably durable. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow. The Franks could win on the battlefield, but could not hold inland territory against constant Turkish harassment. The Turks could devastate and exhaust, but could not take the Frankish coastal strongholds or destroy the Frankish field armies outright. Both sides became, over decades, adapted to a kind of permanent limited war that neither could win and neither could afford to stop. For all the talk of equilibrium, the Crusader States were not passive. At multiple moments in the first half of the 12th century, they came breathtakingly close to seizing prizes that could have transformed the entire strategic situation. The most tantalizing near miss involved Aleppo. By the late 1110s, the great Syrian city found itself in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. A series of Frankish campaigns had established a ring of castles around Aleppo's hinterland. The city's ruler was weakened by internal conflicts. Contemporary observers, both Frankish and Muslim, recognized that Aleppo was within reach. Then came the disaster known as the Field of Blood. In June 1119, a Frankish army under Roger of Antioch marched to relieve pressure on Frankish-held territory and was annihilated in an ambush. Roger himself was killed, one of the very rare instances in this period of a Frankish commander dying in defeat. The window of opportunity around Aleppo slammed shut. The initiative that had seemed so close to producing a transformative conquest simply evaporated. Damascus presented a different kind of near miss. The great Syrian city, richer, more populated, and more strategically critical than Aleppo, was the prize that everyone recognized as decisive. Whoever held Damascus held the key to the Near East. In 1129, the pieces seemed to align. A network of conspirators inside Damascus had made contact with the Frankish court, promising to open the gates if an army arrived. A major crusading expedition had just brought fresh forces from the west. The attack was launched. And then, at the critical moment, it collapsed. The city's gates did not open. The conspirators were arrested and executed. The Frankish army withdrew. The Second Crusade siege in 1148 made another attempt. The Western armies arrived intending to conquer the city. Instead, they abandoned the siege after just 4 days, withdrawing in disorder. The consequences were catastrophic. The failure destroyed the strategic relationship between Damascus and Jerusalem that had kept both states viable. Faced with evidence that the Franks could not be trusted, Damascus turned toward the Zangid dynasty for protection. Within a generation, Damascus had fallen under Zangid control, bringing unified Muslim Syria one giant step closer to reality. How were these wars actually fought? The mechanics matter because they explain so much about why the Crusader States survived as long as they did, and why they ultimately collapsed. The Frankish army was built around the heavy cavalryman, the knight. A single Frankish knight represented an enormous investment of resources, a destrier warhorse armor, weapons, the training of a lifetime, and the collective power of a Frankish cavalry charge was, for the first half of the 12th century, something that very few forces in the world could withstand. The charge worked through psychological terror as much as physical impact. A wall of armored men on armored horses accelerating to full speed, crashing into a formation with no good options. Stand and be trampled, give way and be ridden down, try to outflank and be caught. For opponents accustomed to looser, more mobile styles of fighting, facing this charge unprepared was catastrophic. Turkish armies operated from a fundamentally different model. Lightly armored cavalry, capable of extraordinary speed and endurance, formed the backbone of Turkish forces. Their preferred tactic was the feigned retreat, pulling back before a Frankish advance, drawing the enemy out of formation, and then turning to attack the now disordered pursuers from all sides. When it worked, it was devastating. Multiple Frankish disasters, including the Field of Blood, resulted from commanders who fell for it. The two sides thus represented radically different approaches to war, and the entire military history of the Crusader States can be read as a slow, painful, mutual adaptation. The Franks gradually learned not to pursue Turkish cavalry into the open. Turkish commanders gradually learned to use combinations of archery, flanking movements, and terrain to degrade Frankish heavy cavalry before it could charge. By the 1170s and 1180s, the tactical advantage the Franks had enjoyed in the early decades had largely eroded. Castles played a critical strategic role for both sides. In a landscape where small armies had to defend enormous frontiers, fortifications were force multipliers. A well-positioned castle could control a mountain pass, dominate an agricultural region, and deny the enemy free raiding without first committing to a long siege. The great Frankish castles, Crac de Chevalier, Marga, Carac, Belvoir, were tools of regional domination, projecting Frankish power across wide areas from positions of almost unassailable security. Yet the Frank siege capabilities created their own paradox. On the coast, Where timber was accessible and harbors could bring supplies, they were excellent besiegers. Inland, siege towers required enormous quantities of high-quality timber, simply not available in the arid Syrian interior. When the Franks besieged Banyas in 1140, they had to transport timber all the way from Damascus. This single logistical constraint goes far toward explaining why, across 44 years of military effort against Syrian targets between 1143 and 1187, the Franks succeeded in capturing only a handful of minor inland strongholds while failing repeatedly against the major cities. The real turning point in the balance of power came not with a single battle, but with the gradual consolidation of Muslim power in Syria under the Zangid dynasty. Zangi, Ataberg of Mosul, was the first Muslim ruler to pose an existential threat to the Crusader States. In 1144, he seized Edessa, the most geographically exposed of the four Crusader states, in a campaign that shocked the Christian world and triggered the Second Crusade. The fall of Edessa was not merely a military defeat. It was a signal that a new kind of unified Muslim power was emerging, that the fragmented Frankish states would struggle to contain. Zangi's son Nur al-Din proved even more formidable. Where Zangi had been primarily a warlord driven by ambition, Nur al-Din was something new, a ruler who wielded jihad ideology as a genuine political instrument, using it to recruit fighters, justify expansion, and delegitimize rivals. Under his leadership, the ideology of holy war was transformed from occasional rhetoric into the organizing principle of a state. Poets celebrated his campaigns. Scholars praised his piety. The Islamic world began to see in him a ruler who might actually reverse the Frankish conquest of Jerusalem, not just contain it. Militarily, Nur al-Din was patient and ruthless. He understood that the Franks were most dangerous when they could concentrate their forces, so he forced them to disperse by maintaining constant pressure across multiple fronts. He invested heavily in siege warfare, building the engineering and logistical capacities his predecessors had lacked. Slowly and systematically, he eroded the northern Crusader States' frontier position. Yet the picture was not entirely one of Frankish decline. The Kingdom of Jerusalem remained formidable throughout this period. At Montgisard in 1177, a small Frankish force shattered a large army under Saladin himself, demonstrating that even in the period historians have labeled Frankish decline, individual encounters could still produce astonishing results. The problem was not that the Franks had become militarily weak. It was that their opponents were becoming better organized, better unified, and better equipped to neutralize the specific tactical advantages the Franks possessed. The figure who finally shattered the Crusader states was not simply a great general. Saladin was, above all, a political genius who understood that military victory over the Franks required first the political unification of the Muslim world. Born into a Kurdish military family that had served the Zangids, Saladin rose through talent, ruthlessness, and extraordinary timing. When the Fatimid Caliphate collapsed in 1171, he absorbed its power. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, leaving Syria in chaos, Saladin marched on Damascus and took it through bribery, persuasion, and military pressure, while loudly proclaiming his loyalty to Nur al-Din's heirs. Over the following decade, he extended control northward, systematically reducing the remaining Zangid territories until Aleppo finally fell in 1183. The Crusader states watched with mounting alarm. For the first time since the original conquest, they faced a single ruler who controlled both Syria and Egypt, who could strike from either direction, and who commanded resources far beyond anything they could match. The nightmare scenario that the Crusader states' founders had feared, a unified Muslim power surrounding them on all sides, had arrived. Even Saladin's rise was not a simple story of unstoppable conquest. He suffered serious defeats, including Montgisard in 1177, he spent years bogged down in conflicts with remaining Zangids and faced rebellions and supply crises. The Crusader States remained formidable opponents throughout the 1170s and early 1180s. What changed the balance irrevocably was his political achievement, the unification of the Muslim Near East under a single command, capable of sustaining operations on a scale no previous Frankish opponent had matched. By 1187, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was in crisis, but not a crisis of military weakness. The Frankish army that assembled in July 1187 was one of the largest ever fielded by the Crusader States. The military orders had mobilized their full strength. The nobility had answered the call. The tragedy of Hattin was not that the Franks lacked soldiers, it was that they were maneuvered into a position where those soldiers could not fight effectively. Saladin besieged Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The Franks debated fiercely about how to respond. The most experienced military minds, including Raymond of Tripoli, whose castle Tiberias was, advised caution. Do not march through waterless hills in July heat to relieve a castle that can survive a siege and risk everything on a single engagement. Raymond made the extraordinary argument that his own fortress and his wife, trapped inside, should be abandoned rather than risk the kingdom's army. Guy of Lusignan, under pressure from more aggressive voices, overruled this counsel. The army marched. Saladin had deliberately chosen Tiberias as his target because he calculated that the Franks could not politically afford to ignore it. As the Frankish army marched east through the Galilean hills in brutal July heat, with insufficient water and under constant harassment from Turkish cavalry, Saladin controlled the water holes, the approach routes, and the tactical situation. By nightfall on the first day, the Frankish army had been forced to camp on a waterless plateau, completely surrounded. The second day, July 4th, 1187, was fought under conditions of extraordinary adversity. The Frankish infantry, desperately thirsty, began breaking formation. Without their infantry screen, the cavalry was exposed. Saladin's forces closed in. The true cross, the most sacred relic of the kingdom, was captured. The king was taken prisoner. The kingdom's military leadership was decimated in a single afternoon. In the weeks that followed, Acre, Beirut, Sidon, Nazareth, Caesarea, Ascalon, and ultimately Jerusalem itself fell to Saladin with minimal resistance. There were simply not enough Frankish soldiers left to defend them. The question has been debated for centuries. Moral decline, religious apostasy, decadent settlers who had lost the martial spirit of their ancestors, all have been proposed, and they are all wrong. The evidence simply does not support the idea that Eastern Franks had become weaklings by Hattin. The tenacity displayed there, 2 days of fighting in extreme heat, without water, under constant pressure, suggests the opposite. What actually happened was more complex. Several factors combined to undermine the Crusader States' position. Manpower was always a constraint. The states were thinly populated, dependent on a steady flow of new settlers from Western Europe. When that flow slowed, the states found themselves increasingly stretched. The failure to conquer the major inland cities, Aleppo, Damascus, Cairo, left the Franks permanently confined to the coastal strip, unable to deliver the decisive blow that might have secured their long-term position. Speed was another problem. Turkish armies built around light cavalry could move faster than the Franks, which meant Turkish commanders could almost always choose when and where to engage. And integrating Western crusading reinforcements proved consistently difficult. Large waves of Western armies periodically arrived with their own agendas and timelines, sometimes doing as much damage as good. The disastrous Second Crusade siege of Damascus in 1148 destroyed the most important diplomatic achievement the kingdom had ever managed. Above all, the unification of the Muslim Near East under Saladin proved irresistible. As long as Aleppo and Damascus were rivals, the Crusader states could play one power against another. Once Saladin brought Egypt and Syria under a single command, that strategy became impossible. The Crusader States now faced a single opponent with far greater resources, capable of sustaining operations on multiple fronts simultaneously, motivated by an ideology that resonated across the Muslim world. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this history is how many times the Crusader States came desperately close to achieving the conquests that might have secured their survival. Aleppo, in the late 1110s, was within reach, ringed by Frankish strongholds, deprived of reliable Turkish support. A slightly different outcome at the field of blood, and the city might have fallen. A Frankish Aleppo would have created a contiguous northern frontier and denied the Zangids the base from which they eventually unified Syria. Damascus in 1129 was the object of the most carefully prepared diplomatic coup in Crusader history. An inside conspiracy, a large army, a moment of maximum pressure. It failed. Cairo in 1168 was briefly within the Franks' grasp during the reign of Amalric I. The massacre at Bilbais permanently alienated potential local allies and foreclosed the possibility of a negotiated transfer of power. 3 opportunities, 3 failures, and in each case, the margin was slim enough that these were not predetermined outcomes. The Crusader States were not fated to fail. This recognition matters. It resists the comfortable teleology that retrospect invites. The idea that because the Crusader States ultimately fell, their fall was somehow inevitable. The truth is that for nearly a century, a small group of settlers from Western Europe maintained themselves as a significant military power in one of the most contested regions of the medieval world, against opponents who were numerically and economically superior. They did so through military skill, diplomatic creativity, tactical adaptability, and a collective stubbornness that contemporary observers on both sides recognized and struggled to explain.